All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Christopher Harrison. You can find me basically everywhere as GeekTrainer. I'm a senior program manager inside of Microsoft Cloud and AI. And welcome to Web Wednesday, the show where I bring on people that are much smarter than me to talk about really cool web dev topics. Now, one of the things that I personally have been really interested in is Blazor, that I've heard an awful lot about it. But if I'm being honest here, .NET is actually not a space I've played around with in quite a while. That I've done an awful lot with .NET, going all the way back to like web forms and ASP.NET 1.0. I even did like SharePoint development. But of late, I've really been spending a lot of my time focused in on different frameworks and haven't really done a lot of .NET. And so I know that there's a lot of really cool stuff. And so I went, oh, I need somebody really smart to talk about Blazor. And so I asked Cecil Phillip, and he said, yes. Now, Cecil is a senior cloud advocate. Inside of Microsoft, does an awful lot of work with .NET, and has certainly forgotten more about both .NET and Blazor than I will ever know. So I'm super excited to bring on Cecil. So let me just go ahead and stop talking and do exactly that. So Cecil, thank you so much for joining today.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It sounds like we're going to have to get you back into that .NET space a little bit so you can catch up on some of this cool stuff you've been missing.
Yeah, absolutely. I had John Galloway on last week, and we talked a little bit about Blazor, but definitely an awful lot about like some of the cool things that are happening now in that .NET space. So it's definitely intriguing. So I'm really curious about it. But I always like to start with this question, which is how did you become you? How did you get to where you are? How did you become Cecil Phillip, senior cloud advocate at Microsoft?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's an interesting story, and every time I come on a show, I feel like I always answer that question. But as much as I talk about it, I feel like a lot of folks still don't know, right? And so I always love answering it. So for people that may not be familiar with me, so I was born and raised in the Caribbean. I was born in a country called Antigua, and I lived in Antigua for maybe like the first 19 years of my life, right? So, very stereotypical island boy kind of thing. And so back when I was going to school, we didn't have computer science education. We didn't even have information technology education at the time, which was what it was called when it first got there. So that means that, there were no computers in the classroom. I didn't even have a computer at home when I was in high school for a while. And, at some point in time, my dad, who had his own office and practice and whatnot, was like, oh, well, he needs like this computer thing to write reports, right? Because before, like, he used to just be typing everything on a typewriter. So he gets this computer thing. It was a compact Presario. So I don't know if I'm dating myself or how many of you remember compact Presarios. But that was when like he bought the computer and it came with everything, right? It came with like it wasn't like monitor sold separately kind of thing. Like it was the monitor, keyboard, like everything. And it even came with a set of books, which was what I realize now is very unique because you don't buy a computer that comes with books, right? So anyway, we get a set of books. And one of the first books that I read out of that batch was one about like how does like the internet work. So I read this book about HTML and JavaScript and and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. But I'm like, well, it was one summer and I was super bored. I'm like, let me try this out. So I tried it and I put my name on the screen. So for a lot of you that are watching are probably like, oh, okay, whatever, that's not a big deal. But for me at like 16, 17 years old, never seen a computer in my life, never mind like understand what programming is. That was like the most amazing thing that I've ever done at that point. And so like I'm calling my friends on the phone, like, yo, you need to come over. Like I just put my name on this computer thing. Like it's crazy, right? And so I just got really excited about that, about the ability to be able to control this device, right? And so that kind of just led me down the road with just experimenting with a lot of things, trying a lot of different things out. And then, when it was time for me to pick a thing in college, I was like, well, let me try this computer thing. Let me see how it works out. And initially, which the second part of the story, which is kind of interesting, I never planned to go to school to be a software developer. Like programming wasn't, again, a thing for me. At that time in my country, most folks that were doing computer things were like fixing machines, right? So all of the examples that I saw of folks working in the industry were like, hey, I'm going to build you a computer, or when your printer doesn't work, I'm going to come and fix your printer, or, I'm going to fix your dial-up, because, we had dial-up and that weird sound used to make. But those are the examples that I had. Like, those were my, the things that I had to work with. But then I came to college and, I started to see more things, like, not just like in terms of society and people, right? But also in terms of the industry, I started to learn like what was possible. You know what I mean? Like, I never left thinking, oh, okay, I could go work for a big company and I could write software. And like, that was never a thing in my head. It was always, okay, I'm going to learn how these machines work. I'm going to learn how to fix them. I'm going to go home and then fix computers like everyone else does. Because again, that was the example. But now I saw the world in a very different light. Like, I can really go work for any company I want to, like doing the software thing. Like, I thought that was super exciting. So to cut the story short, so that's kind of how I got into programming. And like, I was one of those folks that, I cared more about my programming classes than my other classes. So, I had, you're in college and you have electives, right? So I had astronomy was a science elective I had to do. I didn't really pay very much attention to that. I had, literature and like all these we have college electives, right? I didn't really care about them very much. But I had this super thick Java book. I don't remember, like programming books were like 1,000 pages. Oh, yeah. Super big. And literally every night, like as soon as I was done whatever homework I didn't want to do, like I'd get that out of the way. And I'm in this Java book, like reading about like, what was it? Like the Java, what was it called? The Java toolkit. I can't remember what it's called. What Swing, I think it was called. I think it was something like that. Whatever the desktop thing for
JDK.
Java.
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, the Java toolkit. Yeah.
Yeah, the Java toolkit, and learning how to do Windows and network programming and all kinds of stuff. And so like I started doing that like on my own. So now I'd fast forward in my programming class while I was behind like the other classes, which, priorities, right? Things happen. But then after that, like I started teaching myself other languages, right? Like I taught myself C#. I think at the time, like the first C# book had come out and I bought it. And again, for a college kid buying a $20 book, like that's a lot of money, in college. So, I bought the book, I read it, I taught myself C#, I taught myself Python and some other languages. And and then, luckily, like out of college, I was able to get a job doing .NET, and I've kind of just been doing .NET ever since.
That's an amazing story. That's an amazing story. That's the fortitude and just that focus to keep going is amazing. Wow. Yeah. I love that story.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about my particular story was it was just based on pure interest. You know what I mean? Like at the time, like there wasn't the everyone needs to learn how to code initiative kind of going on, kind of like what you have today. I was generally just really interested from the moment that I put my name on the screen. I was just like, this is the coolest thing ever. Like, you gotta see this. And I just wanted to understand how it was like a puzzle to me, right? And you want to understand like where to, like, when people do puzzles, like you start with the corners and like you kind of work your way in. Mm-hmm. Like I wanted to get like those foundational pieces, right? I wanted to understand like where the puzzle pieces sat, and then I try to like fill out the middle of the picture as I went in. So I never went thinking, okay, I'm going to be like, again, a network guy or a security guy or a web person. You know what I mean? Like the web was something I kind of fell into. So again, like after college, and when I say I fell into it, I didn't learn, web development in school, right? Like I was writing console applications like all over the place. But at the time, so I graduated college, excuse me, like 2000, I think it was 2006, right? With my degree, and every job that was up was for web developers. I'm like, I don't know how to do web development, at least not from like a professional perspective. There was JSF was a big thing. That was Java server pages or server faces or whatever it was called. ASP.NET for .NET Framework was a big thing. I think Django was just starting up or getting going or whatever. And so all these web frameworks, and I'm like, I can write code, but I can't build an application, right? Which is one of the things that you see with a lot of folks that come out of college without experience.
Yep.
Like I could code and I know libraries and stuff, but like I've never put together an entire application by myself. And so my first job was interesting because, one as I mentioned before, I was an international student, which meant that I need sponsorship and I need to get a visa and all that type of stuff. So I took the first job that I got that was like, I'm going to pay you. I'm like, yes, I get to stay. But then also from the first 6 months, which I guess for most people is like your evaluation period at a job, I spent that first 6 months reading books, which was not, wasn't different from what I was doing in college anyway, right? Just that I didn't have to read literature books and history books anyway. I could just read the programming books I wanted to read. But I was just reading books, right? So I read a book about ASP.NET's web forms was the thing that the company was doing at the time. I read tons of C# books because, again, like I knew C# from a construct perspective. When it came to things like how do you structure a project, how do you like where do the assets go, right? Like it's one thing to like say, okay, I could create a class and I can type the thing, but then it's like, well, where do I put it and how do I deploy it, right? And how do I work with a teammate? Like those types of things is not something like I came out of school, and so I had to like figure that out over time. So my first 6 months I was just reading a book, and then me like getting in the habit of reading constantly kind of just turned into me reading throughout my whole career. I still read a lot of books, particularly programming books, but like that habit kind of just stuck with me, and I'm constantly reading stuff. Now it's more like blog posts and like 1,000-page books, but it's that habit of constantly learning. That again at the time and like in 2006 2007 you were just like, well, I'm just trying to work, I'm trying to not get fired. But that kind of turned into me like going to user groups and like finding other people that had that curiosity and that level of passion that I had. And again, my passion was driven by I want to stay in the country. I don't want to lose my job. But then I kind of kept it, right? And so now, like, who else cares about stuff this much? Like, because usually my friends at work or my coworkers were like, Cecil, it's 5 o'clock. Like, stop talking to me about programming, kind of thing. And I was like, but like, this is new, and this is faster. We should do this. And so I left the work bubble and started going to user groups and started going to code camps. And that's where like I discovered that community, right? And I think the community was, if you kind of look at the timeline in terms of like professional development, like, I started with, oh, wow, this is cool, to, okay, now I'm going to study and I'm going to understand like what's possible. And then now I found the community that took me from like here to here. You know what I mean? So every step like kind of helps push you forward to another level, right? And so now I swear if it wasn't for the community, like I never would have gone into public speaking. I never would have gotten into, putting stuff on GitHub or even learning Git at the time that I learned it. You know what I mean? I probably just learned it for work whenever work decided to get there. Right. But, I learned it so I could be with the community, right? So by the time work got there, like that was like yesterday's news for me kind of thing. But, like doing presentations and all that type of stuff, like, again, you don't leave a computer science degree knowing that stuff for most of us. And so now these are all things I developed going to code camps and stuff. And code camps turned into conferences and conferences turned into other things. And eventually that turned into a job at Microsoft doing the exact same thing, where now I'm able to help students, companies, startups, different types of folks learn about programming. But not even just beginners, but also folks that might be transitioning into one framework to another, one language to another, from on-premises to the cloud, right? Like everyone's always learning, right? Everyone's always reading the thing. But I think a part of that story, and where all of our stories is different, is that we don't all have the time to do so.
Right.
Like I can tell you, my reading habits changed when I had a child. You know what I mean? like I didn't have as much free time as I wanted to just sit down and read programming books or go hang out or do other stuff, right? And so now, when you think about other folks that are beginning at that point, like they're beginning at, I don't have a lot of time now versus, okay, I used to have a lot of time, but now I don't. You know what I mean? Now we have to think about, well, how can we get them the information they need in a very compact way, like just kind of just get into it. You know what I mean? So that, okay, well, now you know like how to go, but you got to figure out how to continue, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And so here you are, and I love the fact that you're also like giving back to the community and like doing things like this and doing blog posts and everything else. And I think that's also just like it's one of the great things about our org is being able to go back and feed the community and help out then the next generation that's coming up.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that I've always said is, at least particularly in this job and even again pre-Microsoft, if you care about like the future of anything,
mm-hmm.
you know what I mean, you have to invest in the folks that are coming behind of you, the folks that come after you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I'm not a super old person. Like I haven't been in the industry for 30, 40 years. But I don't think you have to be to recognize that it's important for you to take the information that you have, regardless of how big or how small it is, and share it with other people, because they might have a similar scenario. They might have a similar use case. You might save them like 10 hours of Google searches or big searches, whatever, just by showing like little tiny piece of code that, for whatever reason, they weren't able to figure it out, but you were. And now being able to share and collaborate, now we can all help each other evolve together. But again, you don't have to be like a PhD person or in the industry for 40, 50 years or whatever the case is. Just like, Chris, like Christopher, sometimes I come out here and I see you doing some stuff on Django. I don't know Django, you know what I mean? And so I could sit down and I could watch what you're doing and understand. I'm like, oh, okay, that's why people like that thing, you know what I mean? Or like that framework or that editor or whatever. But it's just, again, it's just different experiences and all of us trying to learn and grow from it.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And so like, speaking of getting in and like learning things, I'm really curious. And this of course is the big reason that I brought you on about Blazor. So I've done a fair bit of Vue these days. And I've done a little bit of like React, and I know that those are different front end frameworks. But I haven't done a whole lot in Blazor. So let's start real simple here. What is Blazor?
Sure. I'll give you like a super high level explanation. I'll give you Cecil's super high level explanation of what it is. And I say that because I'm not on the team, on the Blazor team. So, anything I say, take it with a grain of salt. But also, I think we'll start at the top and kind of work our way down into the different layers.
Yeah.
Blazor is a new component model or a new programming model for building web applications that run on top of ASP.NET Core, right? So ASP.NET Core being the cross-platform open source version of ASP.NET, right? Which is different from ASP.NET, different from the .NET framework, which is Windows only, not open source type of situation, right?
Yep.
Now, Blazor, which is really interesting, introduces a component model. So if you think about how folks used to, stereotypically build web pages, I'll write a bunch of HTML and CSS and whatnot, but then it's all this tag, that tag, whatever, and it's kind of like littered across the page, right? And so then moved into a phase where, okay, well, we're going to create templates for these things. Folks, remember web templates. And if you ever use like Front Page, I'm dating myself a little bit. If you remember Front Page, Dreamweaver.
I loved Front Page.
Right? And so now you're able to do this templating thing. With templating, it means that like I don't have to copy the header and the footer and the colors and all that stuff to every single page, right? I can start to reuse some of that functionality, and still I can just add the parts that change, right? So then we moved into another layer where we talked about like web frameworks. And we look at things like like Django and ASP.NET Web Forms and those types of things, where you can use a programming language like Python, like .NET, like Java, like JavaScript on the back end, and it'll generate a lot of those pages for you. So now I didn't have to write HTML and stuff like that by hand. I mean, I could still write it, but like most of it can kind of, come out of the box for me, and I can only need to tweak the things I need to tweak. And so that introduced a really interesting programming model. And it also allowed not just web developers, but developers, period, to really work with the web in a very flexible way. Right? And I'm getting to it. I know this is a super long answer.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you the backstory, because when you understand the backstory, you'll understand the benefit of the future, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And now when we moved forward and we started to talk about things like JavaScript frameworks, one of the things that you've seen, particularly in the phase of like Vue and React and Svelte and those types of things, is that, well, now we're not just like putting HTML and CSS and JavaScript and stuff on the page, but now we've moved into a phase where we create components, right? And components being like customized, specialized fragments of HTML, but like they have their own specific functionality that you might have coded or someone else might have coded, and you can bring those into your application. So now going back to that model I talked about where we had templates and we had reusability, now it becomes even easier to reuse not just the styling and the look and feel of things, but we could reuse functionality, which is really cool. So that means that if I had like a shopping cart button, and maybe in the back end, that shopping cart called an API and it did validation and it did stuff, right? Oh man, like, does that mean I have to copy this over to this other thing and whatever, and move it around? Well, now I can just kind of restart to reuse those things. And I know it should work because, well, I'm just talking about HTML and CSS, right? And it should be able to work across the board. And so again, if you're familiar with React, if you're familiar with Angular, if you're familiar with Vue.js, you're familiar with that essence of a component, right? So inside of your HTML, you might have like a body tag and, maybe a main or section tag or a nav bar, whatever the case is. But then you'll have like an app tag or something of that sort. And now that renders your app and it renders your table and renders all these other things. But that particular section is very much customized from that web framework, right? So now where Blazor comes in is now it enables .NET developers to use those similar types of component models. But not only are you using the component model with ASP.NET, but you can also write it in .NET. So any .NET applicable language. So for most folks, that means C#. So if you're a .NET developer and let's say for whatever reason you're JavaScript averse, you didn't want to get into that world. You could,
a lot of people are JavaScript averse.
a lot. I mean, everyone has their opinion, right? I know I have my own. If you're JavaScript averse and you're like, oh man, like I don't want to have to learn a Vue.js to write a component. I don't want to have to learn React or TypeScript and Webpack and all the things. I just want to write a component that'll work inside of my ASP.NET core application. Mm-hmm. And so Blazor really enables us to do that, right? And again, I have some examples and I'll show you what all this talking actually looks like and what it means. But that's what we could look at as. Blazor is an application programming model that sits on top of ASP.NET Core that now allows us to create these reusable components that we can share functionality, we can share styling and CSS, we can share, the structure of an application without having to rewrite those things in like different languages. And we can just leverage the power of C# and .NET and NuGet and pulling in NuGet packages to kind of enhance our apps.
Okay. Let me just, there's like two key features that I picked up in there. The first is the fact that I can now create these reusable components that go beyond just like a normal HTML tag, that I can create a component that does something that maybe, like you mentioned, displays a shopping cart, or is how it is that I want to display if I'm creating like an HR site, a particular employee or something like that. And now I can just drop that component and that now works works. But then the other big thing that I'm hearing, and this is, of course, like the appeal of writing in Node, and we can, have the debate about, JavaScript on the server. I have a couple of dear friends of mine who are just convinced that JavaScript doesn't belong on the server, and I'm not in that camp. That I really do like being able to write JavaScript, or more specifically TypeScript, for front and back. But it sounds like that's another great advantage here, is that I don't necessarily have to learn JavaScript, that I can write everything using the exact same tooling, using the exact same language that I'm writing the back end with. So I'm writing my back end in C#, I'm using those NuGet packages, and now I can just bring that with me to the front end and just keep reusing all of those skills that I already have.
Yeah, for sure. And you said, some folks don't believe JavaScript belongs in the backend. There's some people that believe nothing else but JavaScript belongs in a browser, right? Like, everyone has an opinion.
Yeah. Yep.
I think here's the thing about opinions, is that opinions are opinionated, which sounds kind of silly, but when I say that, I mean, your opinion might not apply to my use case. You know what I mean? Like, your opinion probably applies to you most of the time, and scenarios that you've seen and experiences that you have had. Experiences that I have had might be a little bit different. Not to say that all opinions are bad, but like, again, opinions are opinionated, right? And so you have to take that, those words and see if it makes sense for you. Now, that being said, when we think about development teams, when we think about being productive at the end of the day, if you have company X, right, and company X makes product Y or Z, whatever the case is, and you use a particular tool set, and now you're like, oh man, like, I need to do machine learning. Oh man, my people that don't know Python, now we gotta go learn Python. Or, I build a lot of mobile applications, right? And your folks do .NET. Oh man, now I gotta go learn Swift and Java, right? And there's nothing wrong with learning other programming languages, because I think there's a lot of benefits they can be from learning different ways to do things. But then again, like, you're a company, and you make money from being productive. So would you rather leverage the skills that you already have and now just learn a new platform being like the web space or the machine learning space or PWAs or IoT or whatever, but still using the tools and languages that you're already familiar with? Or are you going to be like, okay, well, I'm just going to learn everything from scratch, right? Like, I'm going to learn C and IoT, and I'm going to learn, what's that thing called? Swift and Objective-C to build iPhone apps, and Java, and then I'm going to, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of stuff that in this industry we could use to learn a lot of things. And, if you look at it from that way, like, it'll, your time to productivity goes down every time, like, you jump out of the bubble, so to speak, and like try and pull in something else. Or, it might be a case that, because again, we work for a company, and, your company probably has time constraints, you jump out of that bubble and you probably make some mistakes that a more seasoned person in that space probably would not have made, because you're not familiar with that space. But again, you have, a time constraint. You got to go in and come out and deploy the thing and ship the product, right? So again, for Blazor, for me, it's, you might be JavaScript averse for one reason or another, but if you're a .NET developer, if you're a web developer, web, .NET, and you want to be productive, you want to build applications that, use that component-based model, very similar to some of the things that we see in Vue and React and some of those other types of things. If you think that programming model would definitely help your productivity and help how you share components, communicate with your team and those types of things, then of course, I think it makes total sense to go that route.
Okay. I love it. So how does a Blazor application look? Like, you hinted at the fact that you had something that you could show up. How does a Blazor app look? And how is that structured? Again, kind of assuming that chances are most of the audience here is experienced with like Java or JavaScript rather, and doing other things with the various MVVM frameworks. How does a Blazor app look then?
All right. Well, why don't I go ahead and show you? I have some demos there. We can take a look at them, and we could check it out and see what it kind of looks like.
I think you have to share your screen again. I think that went away when you refreshed.
Oh, is it not sharing? Okay, I'll share my screen with you right now, and there you go. Let me know if you can see it.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, now this is an app that I built some time ago. I don't remember when I built this. I built this a while ago. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to run it first, just so you can see what the app looks like running. But then after it's running, I'll go ahead and we'll walk through the code and see what this looks like. And,
Cool.
and then we'll talk about some of these different ways of serving Blazor things. All right, so now I got this in the browser. And of course, it opened in the wrong window. I didn't want it to open there. Too many windows. Hold on. Where do I want to put this? Yeah, this one goes over here.
I swear, every OS, when you open up a new window, it just like randomly selects where it wants to put it.
Yeah. Why would you go over there? I'm not even like looking that way. All right. So this app is called Composer Crafts, right? Composer Crafts, it's a fairly simple application. It is literally one page, right? And the only thing that happens on this page is that, as you can see here, we could see there's different products on this page, right? Like I can click these little buttons and whatnot. I can see info about stuff. I notice there's a pop-up here. There's like this little vote rating situation. I can add stuff to cart. Notice when I add to the cart, I don't know if you could see it or not. I'll zoom in here super quick. Like I have a shopping cart button looking thing. And this is using Font Awesome. In case folks are wondering, I did not draw this because I am not artistically inclined either. But we can click on some of these things, and that's really what it does, right? I do the clicky thing. I can see all the things I added to the cart. Like I just, added these while we were just talking. I can hit submit and then it clears it out, right? And that's what happens.
Okay.
Now, simple. So again, I wanted to show you that so you could see the different parts of the app that are involved. Now, remember, Blazor is something that is based on components. Again, if you're familiar with Vue, React, those types of things, you'd understand what components mean. So if we were supposed to look at this page, how would we deconstruct this page to be like a collection of reusable components, right? Like what are the things that we see on this page that are either repeated or show up more than once or could probably benefit from being turned into a component, right? So I'll give you an example. Like each one of these cards, I guess you can call them cards. This is using Bootstrap. Each one of these things here, right, that represents a product is its own component, right? So 1, 2, 3, but it's not like different components. It's the same component with just like different data in it. You know what I mean? So it's not like I copied and pasted this like X amount of times, right?
So I just want to real quick, because you mentioned that you're using Bootstrap there. So first of all, yay, Bootstrap. I love Bootstrap. But also B, that you're still able to then use like other normal client-side tools. So Bootstrap, of course, being a client-side framework, HTML, CSS, and obviously JavaScript for some of the stuff that you want to do. So you can still use that then with Blazor.
Yeah, for sure. You can still use any of your HTML, CSS tool chains. So for folks that use Less or Sass, you can still use that. For folks that use, if you want to use JavaScript and Blazor together, that's totally fine. That's a completely acceptable use case. That's a thing that you could do. But yeah, so yeah, you can definitely use like any of your existing tools if you wanted to. Again, at the end of the day, Blazor is just a web framework. So, and again, I'll show you this in a second. But all I'm doing is I just have a tag that imports Bootstrap from, just like you normally would. You can get it from a CDN or whether you get it from a local folder. It's, again, we're just rendering a page. And so you don't have to do anything special to pull these things, at least not from a CSS perspective, to pull these things in. JavaScript is a little different, and we can talk about that. But in terms of like the styling and pictures and those types of things, we're really just talking about like a standard workflow of using, HTML. Right. So again, I mentioned so each of these little boxes is a component. This button here is a component in itself. And technically this is a component with two elements in it, right? Like this circle is its own thing. And like this picture of the shopping cart is its own thing, right? And if you notice, we have a little bit of like dynamicness, right? So when I click this, it actually updates the number there, right? So that's, you can see some interactivity happening. And then this nav bar also is a component, right? So that being said, let's head back over to VS Code. I think this is the right one. This is the right one. And let's I got to make sure I have the right window open. Let's take a look at what it actually means to have this Blazor component. Right. So I'll just give you a look at some of them. Why don't we take a look at the shopping cart component? Because I think this is one of the smallest ones to look at. And so it might be one of the easiest ones for folks to grab. So in terms of writing a Blazor component, so remember I said Blazor essentially is a combination of the browser and Razor. That's where Blazor comes from, right? Browser as a web browser and Razor. And Razor being like the templating language that we use to write. Because again, remember we talked about templates, right? So templating, the templating language that we use to generate the HTML and CSS. Now, what Razor does is it allows you to add C# into these .razor files, right? And then using these Razor files, we can create what's called a Blazor component. So here, you know, the entire amount of CSS for that component, and that component being like this little button that's here, right? Is this. It's literally, I have a component that's literally just a button, you know? And then notice here, I have this font awesome thing that's here. But when you look at it, for the most part, this is mainly just HTML and CSS. Let me hide that sidebar really quick, right? Now, the part that C# and .NET come in is when I want to do things like handle like events, for instance. So, you know, I have a button and I want to click on that button and I want some action to run when I click on it. And in JavaScript, you'd usually have like a, you know, add event handler or something of that sort. But here, notice in C#, we use the @ symbol, and then I could say @onClick, and then I'm just saying, hey, I want you to call this function. You see how VS Code likes to pop things up when I don't want it to? But that's cool too, because it also gives you information about what's happening. Every time you see an @ symbol in a Razor file, or excuse me, in a Razor file, that's when you know you're leaving the world of regular HTML and CSS, and you're entering the world of .NET, right?
Okay.
So every time you see me with this @ sign, notice it has like some Microsoft ASP.NET something in there, right? That's not regular HTML, right? That's some, you know, some .NET stuff. So that would mean if I open this, somewhere in here, I should have a function called checkout, which I actually do, right? And notice I have this checkout function. And what this checkout function is doing is this really just publishing an event. And I have a package that's essentially just like firing off into the ether and say, okay, well, this thing happened, right? But, you know, and I'll talk about what some of this other code does, but for the most part, just know that here you go. Here's a button. This is a Razor component. And then also, I'm sorry, a Blazor component. And then here's the code that's associated with it. So if I go back to what I was saying before, for folks that are used to creating React, having the code and the, you know, the markup in the same space, like this should be a fairly familiar model to you, right? Like this code is associated with this button, you know? But then now that means that in different parts of my application, I could just use shopping cart button, right? Shopping cart .razor. Now let's do this. I'm going to open the sidebar.
Yeah, I was actually, because you had highlighted, you know, that if you've done Vue, I was actually going to mention exactly that it looks so much to me like Vue or like Knockout, which are the two that I played around with the most. But I also know React and all the other ones are kind of similar. Is, you know, that click, here's the name of the function, and then you're creating that down below. Like this looks so familiar to me. So even though I've only ever done this in like the JavaScript world, so to speak, it still feels very natural to me.
Right, and I think that's one of the goals too, is one, it has a very familiar programming model to some of those other JavaScript frameworks.
Yeah.
And like a little bit of trivia for you. So you didn't mention Knockout.js. So Steve Sanderson, who was the creator of Knockout.js, is, I guess you could call him the father of Blazor, right?
Okay.
So again, like, you know, there is a history of experience from building web frameworks, you know, outside of Microsoft and outside of .NET that has kind of influenced the way that Blazor looks today. Okay. Now, what I did want to show you is, well, how do I use this button, right? Like, where is it actually in my code? Because this is just the component, but like, where's the component being used? Like, what does it kind of look like? And let me move this around a little bit. Now, inside of my layout, so remember we talked about front page and stuff like that, because, you know, we're old. So here, what you're seeing, this is just a regular page for the most part. And so, I have my HTML, I have my doc type, I have my head tags and all this types of stuff, right? I remember we spoke a little bit about Bootstrap and Font Awesome. You can see I'm pulling them in here in the set of link tags at the top. And mostly everything in here is HTML and CSS, right? So, CSS, div tags, Bootstrap tags, so on and so forth. Here on line 29, like here's where the good stuff starts to happen, right? Here, I'm inside of a regular HTML page, quote unquote regular HTML page, but I'm saying here, inside of this page, I want you to inject a Blazor component. So that's why I say it says components type of this component. And then here, when I say, targets this thing, this is just kind of defining what the ID or, that thing, what's the ID of that thing generated going to be, right? But this is just me creating that component, right? So if I copy this 3 or 4 times, I'd have like 3 or 4 different instances of that component. We don't want to do that, but if you wanted to, again, you could. Let's take a look at the other component. I want to show you these ones, right? These ones that actually generates the data that's showing on the page a little bit. Now, if I open I'm going to show you this other example. This one is called product list. Now, the product list is a component, and each of the products, right? Each of the product things is in themselves, like each card is their own component, right? So what do I mean by that? So this whole thing here, remember, like I told you before, is a Blazor component, right? Now, here's my, CSS and HTML and whatnot. But then notice I have a for loop, right? Again, every time I see an @ sign, I leave the world of regular HTML and I enter the world of C# and .NET, right? And so I'm using C# syntax in here. This is not like Blazor specific syntax. This is C# that I'm writing. And so if you're familiar with C#, we have a for each statement. And, I'm going to get some products. I'm going to load it into this page. And then I just generate these Bootstrap classes, right? So everything in here is Bootstrap. Cards and card titles and footers and so on and so forth. Except for the parts where you see I have this @ sign. Notice I see the @ symbol again. Again, every time we see the @ symbol, we're leaving the world of HTML and CSS and we're entering the world of .NET. And notice it says on click, whenever you click this thing, I'm going to pass in the product ID, right? And the product ID came from this list of products here, and I'm going through each of them one at a time. I want you to, this will be like the select button that you saw. That's this one, when I click info, right? And then this other button here, I have a second button, which is called add to cart, which is this button here, right? So 2 buttons with 2 different functions, right? And then you'll see that stuff here at the bottom. Now, one of the things that you'll notice that's a little bit different, and let me know if this is confusing for folks in the chat. Let me know if, I'm jumping the gun a little bit. One of the things that you could do with this model is that you can choose to have your code and markup together or separate. Now, for me, if the component is simple, when I say simple, if you see the shopping cart one, this is all that it is. It's simple, quote unquote, relatively speaking. There's not a lot of stuff happening here. All it does is it just shows stuff, right? The product list one is a little bit more involved. And so because of that, I chose to separate the code and the markup, right? So if you notice, this particular file has no code in it. It doesn't have any non-markup code, right? Like it only has the HTML and CSS and whatnot in it. But there's no.
It still looks a lot like a JSX page, though, to me.
Yeah, exactly. Very, 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 very similar lineage if you think about it from that perspective.
Yeah.
So now I have another file here, product lists.base. I could call this the name of this file whatever I want, but inside of here, again, this is where if I had more .NET-y things to do, for me it's easier to do it this way because now, again, there's a lot more code in here. And I think then we get into a conversation about like readability. You know what I mean? If you have components with a lot of functionality in it, like it might be a good idea to separate them up. But what you do see is I do have that add to cart function. And then somewhere else in here, you should see I have that. Here you go. There's that select product function.
Okay.
Right? And then I'm just, all of my products in this particular application are really just coming from a JSON file. I'm not calling a database or anything like that. So, if I showed you this thing, right? Like, so, these are all my products. This is just, super simple database for super simple demo,
Yep.
So, right. So then, like I was showing you, we have the model of we can have them all together, or we can also have them all separated if we wanted to. Now, here's one thing I want to tell you about Blazor that I think is really interesting for folks. With Blazor, you have the option to create different types of application models. At least I call it an application model. I don't know what the official terminology for it is, but you can have Blazor rendered in different places. Now, most folks know Blazor from a WebAssembly perspective. And when I render Blazor in WebAssembly, essentially what that means is that I'm treating it just like I would any other SPA framework. That means that it's not going to be, the page is not going to be generated on the server. It's going to be generated in the browser. So,
Real quick term definition. What is WebAssembly?
Okay, sure. So what's WebAssembly? So WebAssembly essentially is a feature that's inside of all modern browsers. And when I say all modern browsers, anything that's not Internet Explorer. But if it's an Edge or new versions of Firefox and even Opera has WebAssembly. I'm serious, man. Some people still use IE for whatever reason. I get it. I understand. Backward compatibility is hard sometimes.
Yep.
But with WebAssembly, it allows you the ability to run native code in somewhat of a sandbox, right? So for some folks who are able to run like C and Rust and Python, like these different programming language other than JavaScript inside of the browser with, obviously with the right tooling and things of that nature. And so WebAssembly gives you that option. Now, again, if we take a step back and we think about the past a little bit, you might have heard of things like Silverlight, or you might have heard of things like Flash, or I think they had a thing called, what's it called? Was it Apex or something like ActionScript and like those types of things?
Gosh, yeah. I spent just like the shortest amount of time trying to learn ActionScript. Could not get my head around it.
Right, but what those things did something similar from the perspective of they were running this code in a sandbox. The difference is that sandbox wasn't a browser native sandbox. That was like, Adobe had Flash, so that was Adobe's extension that you had to download and install inside of your machine. Silverlight was Microsoft's version of that. You had to download and install it in your machine. Everyone today that has a modern browser has WebAssembly already in it, right? So instead of you worrying about like a vendor-specific thing, right, you can use a standards compliant thing, and then now you can build upon that sandbox to run different code. So now what Steve Sanderson and the rest of the folks that work on Blazor were able to do, they were able to take .NET, which is not written in JavaScript, and compile the runtime into a state that it is able to be ran inside of the browser. So technically what's happening is that every time you run a WebAssembly rendered Blazor application, that initial page load or that initial, first time to render, you're going to see like there's a lot of DLLs. Because when you run .NET things, it's like a .dll. Just like if you ran a Python thing, it's a .py file or something like that. But anyway, you load these things into the browser, very similar to what you would have done on your web server on your machine. And now those DLLs are running in that WebAssembly sandbox on your browser. But what that also means too, from a bandwidth perspective, I'm not making a request back to home, right? Like I'm not phoning home, you know what I mean? Like everything is happening on the machine. So that means that like the responsiveness is a little bit faster, like the perceived performance of responsiveness is a little bit faster. And then again, you're not using bandwidth to go refetch data. Like a lot of the work can happen on, in your browser, which is really cool. So those are some of the things that you get from rendering with WebAssembly. There is another model where you can render Blazor on the server side, right? So you can go server side or you can go client side, all depending on what you do. When you do server side Blazor, essentially what happens, the interaction is a little bit similar. But what happens now is it does what's called DOM diffing. DOM diffing, again, if you've ever listened to like a JavaScript person talk about, using, making the DOM faster and all that type of stuff, they usually talk about DOM diffing. And DOM diffing is saying, hey, if something's changed, like I don't know, let's say I added, let me show my browser here really quick. Like I've added a a none of one of these things, or this this component went from 2 to 3 or 2 to 1 or whatever the case is, the DOM has changed, right? The state of the world has changed. And so now I have to recalculate what it looks like. So with DOM diffing now, I could say, okay, well, this is the part of the page that changed. Instead of me reloading the entire page, I could just change that little piece of it that now looks different. So if you do Blazor on the server side, it'll do some DOM diffing for you. And instead of refreshing the page, and I'm sure we remember page reloads and how that was. It just changes that little piece, which again, like the perceived performance is a lot faster.
So this is, I think, like a perfect time to bring in. So Dragnet asks, I think a great question then is, how does WebAssembly deal with SEO? Because obviously, if Bing or Google or any of the others are coming through, they're not going to download and run the DLLs, much in the same way that they're not going to download and run the JavaScript. How do they then handle SEO so that way the page can be properly crawled, my description can show up, and things like that?
Yeah, I would say, and I'm not an expert at this, so please don't quote me and say the Microsoft guy said this. But I will say,
heading to Twitter now.
Going to Twitter, Cecil said you could do this. From my perspective and from my experience, because again, I'm not an SEO expert, I would assume that you would have the same types of concerns that you would have if you were just using a regular JavaScript framework. Regular JavaScript framework being like something that is just rendered in the browser. Because a lot of that stuff is fairly dynamic. Like the routing and that type of stuff happens in the browser, not on the server side. So a lot of that stuff is a little dynamic. Now, if SEO is important to you, you can do one of those options that I mentioned before, and you can have some of that stuff pre-rendered, right? Like you can render it on the server side. If it's rendered on the server side, whenever like the spiders and the bots and the little, internet minions come hitting your site, they could be like, oh, okay, well, this is the part that's important. I would also argue with you, like, I don't, like, what do you think would be the benefits of also writing something in WebAssembly for a front-facing SEO important website? I mean, like, I'd also, there's also some questions we should probably have in conversation around that.
Yeah.
But if that's something that's important to you, I definitely recommend you could use the option of having some stuff pre-rendered on the server and some parts of it, dynamic on the front end. Again, it all depends on the strategy that you want to use and the things that you want to have happen with it.
Okay, I love it. Cool. We've got a few minutes left here. So let's. I'm trying to figure out what it was that that I wanted to go with. Let me ask you this: is for somebody who's done, let's say, HTML, JavaScript, somebody like myself, I'm just going to make this all about me here for a minute. Is where should I go then as a next step to learn?
Sure. So learning is like a complicated thing. People think it's easy, but learning is complicated because everyone learns differently and there's different strategies for that. If you're a person that HTML, JavaScript, but maybe you're like a new developer, you know what I mean? Maybe you just have a year or two of experience under your belt. And even if you have more experience too, but like if you're a younger developer in terms of experience, I would definitely recommend you just go straight to docs.microsoft.com, or you can do docs.asp.net as an example. That would just send you to docs.microsoft.com anyway. And then read through some of the Blazor documentation and understand what are the different hosting models. Again, I talked about server rendered and WebAssembly rendered in the browser. Think about things like how does it work with cores? How does it work with security? How does it how can I do like virtualization? Virtualization meaning like I want to have like really fast scrolling of lists and things of that nature, right? Like when we think about that stuff, and like read about it and understand like how these things work. If you're a person that maybe you're really familiar a little bit with like how the web works and have a little bit more experience, and honestly, we have tons of great videos that are on our .NET channel YouTube. And the reason why I say that is because like as a younger developer, like you might read some of that stuff or watch some of that stuff, and it might kind of like go over your head, like, whoa, what is all this stuff? Visual Studio, Azure, I don't know what that stuff is. But if you're familiar with that stuff, like we have tons of great videos on Blazor. We have tons of great samples as well. I would tell you, sometimes like even this sample is available online. The way that I learned Blazor was just like reading other people's code. Like I have not read the docs. Don't tell my boss I said that. I probably should read them. But I learned Blazor by looking at code because for me, that worked out well. That's worked out well in the past. And so you might be that type of person. You want to go in and dig into that. For folks that want to go like the paid route, you know what I mean? Like if you have LinkedIn Learning, there's tons of great stuff on there. Pluralsight, there's tons of great stuff on there. I'm trying to think about who else. Yeah, we have tons of great partners that do a lot of learning things for us. In addition to that, like if you head over to Microsoft Learn, so not just docs, but if you head on to Microsoft Learn, you have a lot of interactive sessions that you could do in the browser. You could build ASP.NET Core application, you can build Blazor applications. We can do stuff with like Azure Static Web Apps in terms of like deploying Blazor to the cloud as an option. Like we have that as well.
Such a huge fan of Azure Static Web Apps. Of everything that we've released in the last handful of years, it far and away is probably my favorite. Yeah,
Azure Static Web Apps is really great. And you know what? It's still in preview, so I can only imagine it just getting better over time. It's like compared to what we had before, it's a really great option for, just really quickly like getting your stuff up and running in the cloud from a static web application perspective. But those would be the things that I'd recommend you do. Another great thing that I'd tell folks, if you're a social media person, because not everyone is, not everyone has like the willingness to reach out to folks, because I know that could be a jarring thing for some people sometimes. But if you are, definitely reach out to the .NET team. You could @.net on Twitter or on Facebook or on all the things that they exist on. Definitely follow folks like Daniel Roth, like, Safiya Abdallah. She's on the team as well. Steve Sanderson, I mentioned him. Again, like tons of great folks that are working on Blazor. And, again, like .NET Conf was last week. We had tons more features, new features on top of the ones that I showed you today. So I think Blazor is a great space to kind of dig into right now, and there's tons of stuff to learn.
I love it. I am going to throw up one last question here. And if you don't know the answer, then that's totally fine. But I at least wanted to give you the opportunity, is about security between Blazor running on the server, so pre-rendered, versus the WebAssembly where it's running on the browser. How does security differ in that space? And again, if you're not a security expert, because I know things can get a little bit tricky there, by all means, you can feel free to pass on that.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about it a little bit. I could talk about it a little bit because this was also one of the areas of improvement with the .NET 5 wave. But again, I would keep saying this. Like, if you're a person that knows how to secure a JavaScript rendered application, you know what I mean? If you can secure, like, the security model is not different from Blazor.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I mean, the code is different, obviously, because it's .NET versus JavaScript, but it's the same type of concerns that you'll have. So, security might mean different things for different people too, right? So security might mean, how do I enable cores and work with that, right? And deal with those types of things. Like for some folks, like that is a security concern. There's the authorization and authentication aspect of it. Like, again, when we think about security of that. And then there's also the security of who can access my web page just from like the URL. Like that's a different type of security we're talking about with HTTPS and, like those types of things. Right. And I would tell you, out of the box, Blazor can tap into a lot of the stuff that's already built in and works with .NET. If you're in Azure, I think we released a package, we as in like the company, not me myself. We released a package called Microsoft.identity.web that makes it really easy to grant and get access to access tokens. So for folks that are wanting to use access tokens to call web APIs and those types of things, it makes it a lot easier to do within your Blazor application. Again, I definitely recommend you go ahead and check that out in the docs. But like those are things that are in the box, and you're definitely able to do. And I can even shoot you to a sample that I believe uses it. I'll go look for the sample really quick and drop it in the chat. But there are samples online of that being something that you could do. But again, like when we think about security, because again, security is a non-trivial thing to talk about.
Right.
As long as you're talking about stuff that's running in the browser, like the security concerns are very similar, right? We're just talking about a matter of, is this like a JavaScript thing, or is this a .NET thing? Is this a browser thing? Like the implementation of it might differ, but like the concerns are still the same. And if folks are familiar with OWASP, so I think it's the Open Web Application Security P. I don't remember what the P stands for. Programs. There you go. It's like every year they have a list of what are the top 10 security vulnerabilities for web applications, and how you mitigate those and how you work with those, right? And so there's tons of packages in the community and .NET things that you can pull into your app. But more importantly, so you have to understand, like, what are you protecting against?
Right.
And I know I'm being a little long-winded, but again, I think this is a non-trivial thing to talk about. One of the things that were even added, again, when we think about security, so local storage, if folks are familiar with local storage, is almost like a way for you to store persistent data in the browser. The thing with local storage is that, if you right-click view source, like, it's not exactly like the most hidden thing in the world. But now we do have support for protected local storage out of the box. Well, not out of the box, but you could use a package to bring that into your application. So again, thinking about security from the protection of data and not just the logging in of a person. You know what I mean? So again, like, there's a lot of different ways that you can secure your app, and I think Blazor so far, particularly with .NET 5, has done a really great job in making sure that developers can do the thing without having to mine for gold kind of thing, if you know what I mean.
Yep. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I love it. And I had to laugh at the view source because, of course, for anybody who's a US based, there was a news program where somebody nationally showed, hey, this is how you can go view source. I do have to, and this will sort of be how we wound up closing, but it's, I think the most important thing is I just want to compliment you on your choice in paint color. That it's absolutely spot on.
Nice.
So yeah.
Oh yeah, look at yours. Yeah. It does look a lot like yours. That's funny.
Somebody actually very early on in the chat, there just wasn't a good opportunity to throw it in, but somebody actually mentioned, are you two in the same room?
No, not. We're not even in the same state. So
no.
There's that. And we both have, is your door white too? So that's my door, my closet over there.
Yep.
So you have the same white. Look at that. That's awesome.
That's
I don't have a bookshelf. I'm gonna have to get a bookshelf and put one like.
Right.
Where's my hand? There you go. Right there.
Yeah.
I had a bookshelf and put it right over there. That's awesome.
That's fantastic. Cecil, where can everybody find you out on the interweb, social media, and all those other places?
Sure. Yeah, definitely feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I never used to be a LinkedIn person until I joined this company, and now I'm a LinkedIn person. But look, I have like the social thing. Where is it? Here. There we go.
Yeah, there you go. Yep.
Yeah, so you can at me at Twitter. Definitely very responsive on Twitter. Relatively speaking, I'm not going to be responsive tomorrow because it's Thanksgiving, so please don't at me. But usually very responsive on Twitter. I do a show on Channel 9. I definitely love for folks to check that out. It's called the On.NET Show. We do have a lot of Blazor content on there. A lot of that goes over to the Microsoft, the .NET YouTube channel, and also on Channel 9 on channel9.msdn.com. So definitely recommend folks go over there, check out some of the work that we've been doing, some of the really cool stories that we've been telling. And if you have any suggestions about things you want to know about Blazor, content that you want us to create, docs that you want us to update or create, even feature requests that you wanted to do, definitely go ahead and send us your feedback. We'd love to hear about what you're building or what you would like to build. And, what can we do to make that a little bit easier for you?
All right. That's fantastic. I love it. Cecil, thank you so much for coming on and chatting about Blazor. Hopefully chat learned a fair bit. I know I learned a fair bit about Blazor, and I'm now definitely interested to get in and take a look. I run a Code and Coffee on Thursday morning Pacific time, where I go in and play around on things. So I definitely think that the next thing I'll have to go in and play around with is Blazor. So thanks a ton for coming on and sharing your knowledge. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely appreciate me on. I mean, there's so much that we didn't even talk about. about yet. But maybe in the future we could talk about doing another one if folks are interested. I'm always down to come back and talk about Blazor and .NET.
Yeah, that'd be great. It'd be great to have you on again. And yeah, thanks. And for anybody who's viewing, we'll be back here next week. I don't know who the speaker is next week, or the other person will be next week, but we will be back next week. So definitely come check us out, and definitely keep an eye on on both Learn TV and on the Microsoft Developer Twitch page. There's always really cool stuff that's coming out. So yeah. Thanks again for everybody for tuning in. Thanks again to Cecil for your time, and we will see you all later. Bye.
Bye, everyone.